Your sapphire destiny is waiting in the deep blue shadows of the future, calling for those brave enough to claim it. We follow the starlit path of a hero destined to change the world through wisdom and unwavering grace. Subscribe now and follow the glow of your own cinematic fate. Sitting on a cot in a forward operating base outside Mosul when my phone buzzed. Not an unusual thing. We got messages all the time, logistics updates, intelligence briefs, the occasional satellite call home. I'd been with First SFOD long enough that nothing really surprised me anymore. You develop this numbness after enough deployments. Not coldness exactly. More like a thick skin that lets you function when everything around you is on fire. I looked at the screen. It was a text from my son. He was 9 years old. Dad, Mom's not home. She left 2 hours ago. Her car is in the ditch at Miller Road. I walked there. There's glass everywhere. Dad, I'm scared. I read it 3 times. Then I was already moving. Her name was Jenna. We'd been together since I was 22 and she was 20, back when I was still in Ranger selection and had no business asking anyone to wait for me. She waited anyway, married me in a courthouse in Clarksville with her sister and my team leader as witnesses. Because we couldn't afford anything else and didn't care, she moved with me to Fort Bragg, then to Fayetteville, then to a small rental house in Kershaw County, South Carolina. When I got the assignment I'd worked 6 years to get. She learned to sleep alone most nights. She learned to not flinch at the phone ringing at 2 a.m. She learned to explain to our son Cody why Dad couldn't make his birthday again this year. She never complained. Not once. Not to me anyway. Kershaw County was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. Which sounds warm until you realize it also means everybody protects everybody. Small town South. Old money and older grudges. The kind of place where the same 3 families had run things for 50 years and weren't planning to stop. We'd bought a house there because it was affordable and quiet and an hour from base. Jenna loved the yard. She'd planted a vegetable garden the first summer and taught Cody how to grow tomatoes. I'd watched her do it over video call from a black site I can't name, and I remember thinking that no matter what happened out here, I had something worth coming home to. That night, the night Cody texted me, Jenna had driven into town for a school board meeting. She was on the parents' committee. 45 minutes there, an hour of meeting, 45 minutes home. She'd done it a dozen times. She never made it home. I got the full story in pieces. From Cody, from the county sheriff's deputy who finally called me 4 hours after Jenna was found. From the ER nurse who took my number off Jenna's phone when Jenna couldn't speak for herself anymore. Here's what I eventually pieced together. Jenna's car had been run off Miller Road, a 2-lane stretch with no guardrails and a steep embankment on the right side. The official report said she drifted off the road, possibly fell asleep, possibly was distracted. Single-car accident. No witnesses. Except there were tire marks on the driver's side of her car that didn't match the road surface. Except the damage pattern on her front left quarter panel was consistent with being sideswiped at speed, not with running off a road. Except my wife drove that road twice a week for 2 years and knew every single curve. And except, this is the part that stayed with me, that I turned over in my mind for the 12 hours it took me to get emergency leave approved and get on a plane. Cody had told me something else in that first text exchange. There was a truck, Dad. A big black one. It was sitting on the side of the road when I got there. It left when it saw me. My son was 9 years old. He'd walked half a mile down a rural road alone in the dark because his mother wasn't home and he was scared, and he'd seen a truck. I didn't sleep on the plane. Jenna was alive. That was the first thing I needed to know and the last thing I allowed myself to feel relieved about. Because once I walked into that ICU and saw her, alive felt like a generous word for what she was. Broken orbital socket. 3 fractured ribs. A deep laceration along her hairline that had required 32 stitches. Contusions along her left arm and shoulder that the ER doc described as consistent with blunt force trauma, possibly from the door or console. Her left knee had been shattered. They'd done emergency surgery to stabilize it, but the attending told me quietly, in the hallway, that she might walk with a limp for the rest of her life. She was sedated. Her face was swollen past recognition. I stood at her bedside for a long time without moving. Cody was with Jenna's mother at our house. I'd called from the airport and her mother had driven 4 hours from Myrtle Beach without me having to ask twice. I'm not going to describe what it felt like to stand there. There aren't words for it that don't sound like something a person says, because they can't say what's actually in them. I'll just say that something settled in my chest that night, something quiet and very cold, and it never fully left. I kissed her forehead. I told her I was home. Then I went to find out what happened. The Kershaw County Sheriff's Department was run by a man named Philip Rourke. He'd held that office for 14 years. His father had held it before him. The department had 11 deputies, 3 patrol vehicles, and a budget that kept getting cut because Rourke's political allies kept redirecting county funds elsewhere, which was fine with Rourke because it meant less oversight. The deputy who'd called me, a young guy, maybe 26, clearly uncomfortable, told me they'd investigated the scene and found no evidence of another vehicle's involvement. Jenna's blood alcohol at the hospital had been 0, which he mentioned almost apologetically, like he knew what I was going to say next. I asked to see the accident report. He said he'd have to check with the sheriff. I asked when I could speak with the sheriff. He said the sheriff was unavailable. I drove to the scene myself that afternoon. The skid marks were still there. The damage to the embankment where Jenna's car had gone down was clearly not consistent with a gentle drift. I took photographs. I measured what I could. I'd spent years building operational pictures from incomplete information in hostile environments. This wasn't so different, except that this time it was personal in a way that nothing had ever been personal before. That evening I called a man named Briggs. Sergeant Major Avery Briggs, retired. 15 years Delta, then 6 more as a contractor. He'd been my team sergeant for the first 4 years I was in the unit. He was 53 years old, built like a refrigerator, and lived on a 40-acre property in eastern Tennessee where he ran a security consulting firm. He answered on the second ring. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll make some calls," he said. "Give me 24 hours. While I waited, I talked to people. Jenna had friends in town. Women from the school board committee, a couple from our neighborhood, a woman named Patrice who ran the diner on Main and who'd become something like a surrogate aunt to Cody when I was deployed. Patrice was the one who told me about Victor Slade. Victor Slade was 44 years old. He owned the largest commercial property development company in the county. He was on the county council. He was on the board of the local bank. He had a standing Friday night reservation at the only decent restaurant in town, and he never waited for a table. His older brother, Dale Slade, was one of Sheriff Rourke's 3 senior deputies, and 3 months earlier, Jenna had stood up at a county planning meeting and formally objected to a zoning variance that would have allowed Victor Slade to convert a protected wetland parcel on the edge of town into a shopping center. She'd organized 12 other parents to attend. She'd put together a detailed environmental impact summary. The variance had been denied. Patrice told me this over bad coffee at 6 in the morning, leaning across the counter with her voice low, like she was confessing something. "People don't cross the Slades in this town," she said. "Not if they plan on staying." I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for 15 minutes. Then Briggs called me back. He'd been busy. In 24 hours, Briggs had connected with 2 people I need to refer to only as former colleagues. One who now worked federal law enforcement. One who did private intelligence work for clients who could afford it. Between the 3 of them, they'd pulled together a picture. The black truck Cody had seen belonged to a man named Hollis Crabtree. Hollis was 38, had 2 prior assault convictions from a neighboring county, and had worked as a property manager for Slade Development for the past 6 years. He was, in the clearest possible terms, Victor Slade's fixer. The day of Jenna's accident, Hollis Crabtree's truck had been spotted by a traffic camera in Kershaw County at 7:52 p.m., 20 minutes before Jenna would have been on Miller Road heading home. The camera was 11 miles from the accident site. The timing was tight but possible. None of this was in any sheriff's report. Dale Slade had been the first deputy on scene that night. I called Briggs back after reviewing what he'd sent me. "I need you down here," I said. "Already packed," he said. Two other men came with Briggs. I won't use their real names. One I'll call Tanner, former 75th Ranger, now doing private security work. The other I'll call Reeves, 10 years naval special warfare before a medical separation, currently a licensed private investigator in 3 states. Both were men I'd operated with. Both understood immediately, without me having to explain what kind of situation this was and what kind of help I was asking for. They arrived on a Thursday. Briggs drove. They brought equipment. We set up in my living room after Cody was asleep, and I briefed them the way I'd briefed 100 missions. Map, players, known information, gaps. The gaps were significant. We knew the probable perpetrator. We didn't know who gave the order, whether this was Victor Slade acting alone, whether Rourke was directly involved, or whether there were others. We didn't have proof that would hold up in any court that wasn't run by someone in the Slade orbit, and we were operating in a county where the only law enforcement was compromised. Tanner said, "So what's the play?" I said. "Evidence first, everything else after." What came next took 11 days. Reeves was licensed and experienced and patient. He documented Hollis Crabtree's movements for a week. He identified a storage unit in an industrial park outside Camden that Crabtree visited twice. He photographed Crabtree meeting with Dale Slade at a gas station on Route 1 at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of meeting you have when you don't want to use phones. Briggs worked a different angle. He had contacts in the State Highway Patrol, people who owed him favors from a joint operation years back. He got access to traffic camera footage that the county had never requested, and that the state had held for 30 days before it would have been routinely deleted. That footage showed Hollis Crabtree's truck on Miller Road at 8:09 p.m. on the night of Jenna's accident, heading away from the scene at a speed inconsistent with someone who just happened to be in the area. I worked the financial thread. 11 years in special operations teaches you how to follow money when you need to. I'm not going to detail the methods. What I found, working with Reeves and his access to public records and financial databases, was a payment of $8,000 from a Slade Development LLC subsidiary to a personal account connected to Hollis Crabtree, transferred 4 days before Jenna's accident. Motive, means, movement, corroborated by independent evidence. It still wasn't enough for a clean handoff to honest law enforcement, because in Kershaw County, there was no honest law enforcement. Rourke's department was the only local option. The state police had jurisdiction, but we needed someone who'd actually act, and that meant going higher. Briggs made a call to his federal contact. She was careful. She told us what we needed and what she could work with. On day 11, we had it. Here's the part I want to be careful about. I have been trained very specifically to do things that most people cannot do. I have operated in environments where the rules of engagement were complex and where the consequences of getting it wrong were permanent. I understand the value of restraint better than most people who have never been in those environments, because I have seen what happens when restraint fails. What we did with Hollis Crabtree was not violent. I want to be clear about that. Reeves located him. Briggs and I had a conversation with him. Hollis Crabtree was not a brave man. He was a man who hurt people when the math was in his favor, and when it wasn't, he was exactly what I expected him to be. We explained his situation to him. We explained his equation to him. We explained what we had. We explained what would happen if he cooperated and what would happen if he didn't, and we were very precise about both. He cooperated. He gave us a signed statement. He gave us a voice recording he'd made himself, the kind of thing a man keeps when he works for someone like Victor Slade. Insurance against the day the math changes. In that recording, Victor Slade's voice gave Hollis Crabtree specific instructions regarding my wife, her route home, and what he wanted done. I sat in my truck outside that storage unit and listened to it twice. Then I drove to the hospital and sat with Jenna for an hour. She was awake by then, still in a lot of pain, still having trouble with the knee, but awake and herself, and when I walked in, she looked at me the way she always looks at me after a deployment, like she's checking to make sure I came back whole. I took her hand. I didn't tell her what I'd found yet. I just sat there. "You have that look," she said. Her voice was rough. "What look? The one you get when you've already decided something?" I didn't answer. She squeezed my hand. "Cody okay? He's good. He's been reading to you every afternoon." She closed her eyes. "Good kid." "Yeah," I said. "He is. Here's the thing about my best friend that I've been working up to saying. His name was Preston Webb. We'd grown up in the same neighborhood in Greenville. Played ball together in middle school. He was the best man at my courthouse wedding. He was Cody's godfather. When I was on deployments, Preston checked on Jenna. He mowed the lawn sometimes. He was the person she called when the furnace broke and she didn't want to bother my unit. He knew our routines. He knew Jenna's schedule. He knew which nights she drove alone. I didn't want to know this. I want to be honest about that. There was a part of me that had all the pieces and was choosing for several days not to put them together because putting them together meant accepting something I didn't have the room to accept on top of everything else. Reeves found it. He wasn't looking for it. Specifically, he was running background on everyone Jenna had regular contact with, which was standard operational procedure. He found it in the financial records. A deposit of $15,000 into Preston's account, made from the same Slade Development subsidiary 9 days before Jenna's accident. He brought it to me quietly, on a Sunday evening while Cody was watching TV in the other room. I looked at the document for a long time. Then I asked Reeves to leave me alone for a few minutes. I went out to the backyard. I stood in the dark next to Jenna's vegetable garden, which needed weeding and watering because she'd been in the hospital for 2 weeks. The tomato plants were still alive. I stared at them. Preston had told Victor Slade about Jenna's schedule. He told him which road she took home. He probably told him she drove alone on school board nights. $15,000. I thought about the times he'd sat at my kitchen table. I thought about the way he'd hugged Cody at Christmas. I went back inside. I put my son to bed. I read him 2 chapters of the book we were working through. I kissed his forehead. Then I went downstairs and I told Briggs. Briggs looked at the document. He looked at me. He said, "What do you want to do?" "Everything by the book," I said. "All of it goes to the federal contact, including Preston." Briggs nodded slowly. "He'll do time." "Yeah," I said. "He will." There was nothing else to say about it. I'd already said everything I was going to say about it in that backyard. The part of me that needed to grieve Preston Webb had done that alone, in the dark, and now I was done. What I was not willing to do was become something I wasn't. I had the package now, the recordings, the financial records, the camera footage, Crabtree's statement. I had enough to put Victor Slade, Dale Slade, Hollis Crabtree, and Preston Webb into federal custody and take the whole arrangement apart in a way that a county sheriff couldn't touch. The federal contact was ready to move. All I had to do was hand it over. That's what I did. The arrests happened on Wednesday morning, 5 weeks after Jenna's accident. I was at the hospital with her when it happened. She was being discharged that day. Finally, after 3 weeks of inpatient care and the beginning of outpatient physical therapy for her knee, we were waiting for the paperwork. She was in a wheelchair, annoyed about the wheelchair, arguing with the nurse about whether she really needed it just to get to the car. My phone buzzed. A text from Briggs. 3 words. All 4 down. I showed it to Jenna. She read it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked at me. "Preston too?" "Yeah." She turned and looked out the window. The hospital was on a small hill and you could see part of the town from there. The water tower, the steeple of the Methodist church, the roof of the elementary school where she'd gone to all those board meetings. "Okay," she said quietly. That was all. Just okay. She'd already known, I think, or suspected. She knew me well enough to know that when I go quiet for a certain period in a certain way, something is wrong that I'm not ready to say out loud. She hadn't pushed. She'd waited. "I'm sorry about Preston," I said. She nodded, still looking out the window. "Me too." The nurse came back with the discharge papers. Jenna signed them. We got her into the wheelchair and then into the car. Cody was waiting at home with his grandmother. When we pulled into the driveway, he came out the front door at a dead run and stopped himself at the last second, remembering about her ribs, and stood there with his arms slightly open looking at her with this expression on his face that I will never forget as long as I live. She opened her arms, and he walked into them very carefully. "Easy," she said. "I'm okay. I'm okay." He pressed his face against her shoulder and didn't say anything. I stood next to the car and watched them and felt the cold thing in my chest begin, very slowly, to loosen. Victor Slade was indicted on federal charges including conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction of justice, and bribery. His brother Dale was charged with obstruction and evidence tampering. Hollis Crabtree pled guilty in exchange for his testimony. Preston Webb pled guilty to conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Sheriff Rourke resigned before he could be formally charged, citing health reasons. The state sent in a temporary administrator to run the department while the county figured out what to do next. 3 of Rourke's deputies lost their certifications. It didn't fix everything. It didn't undo anything. Jenna still goes to physical therapy twice a week. She still has a slight catch in her left knee when she walks downstairs. She still sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night, and I can tell, even before she says anything, that she's been back on Miller Road in her sleep. But she's here. She's in her garden. She's at school board meetings. Different ones now, with different faces, and she goes with Patrice from the diner, and she doesn't drive alone at night anymore, and I don't ask her to. Cody found out about Preston when he was older. We didn't lie to him, we just waited until he could hold it. When I told him, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that surprised me. "Did you want to hurt him, Dad?" I thought about the backyard, the tomato plants in the dark. "Yes," I said. "But you didn't." "No." He nodded. He seemed to be working something out. "Because of us? Because of me and Mom?" "Partly," I said. "And partly because of who I want to be when this is over." He thought about that for a while. He was 12 by then, almost 13, and sometimes the things he said reminded me of his mother, and sometimes they reminded me of something I was still trying to become. "I think that's the right answer," he said finally. "I don't know if it was. I'm still not sure. There are nights I run it back and wonder if I made the right call on every piece of it, the methods, the timeline, the decision to handle certain things ourselves before handing it over. In another life, in another context, some of what we did would look different than it does from the inside. What I know is this: Jenna is alive. The people who chose to hurt her are facing consequences for it. My son knows that his father came home and that coming home meant something. And the tomatoes came in that fall. First good harvest in 2 years. Jenna stood in the garden in the October light with dirt on her hands and called Cody over to show him which ones were ready, and I watched from the back porch with a cup of coffee, and I let myself feel for just a minute like it was going to be okay. Not fixed, not the same as before, but okay, that's enough. For now, that's enough. I've thought a lot about what Victor Slade believed when he made his decision. He believed he was untouchable. He'd been untouchable for years. His brother wore a badge. The sheriff owed him favors, and the town had learned a long time ago to look the other way when the Slade name came up. He probably thought about Jenna the way powerful people think about obstacles. Something to be moved, cleared, dealt with. He didn't think about what came after. He didn't think about who she belonged to, or more accurately, who belonged to her. That's the thing about people who abuse power over a long enough period of time. They start to believe the absence of consequences means there are no consequences. They confuse patience with weakness. They confuse silence with surrender. I have seen this pattern, the certainty of the untouchable, in places far more dangerous than Kershaw County, in men far more resourceful than Victor Slade. And every single time, without exception, it ends the same way. Not because the universe is fair and not because justice is automatic. It isn't. And anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't been paying attention. It ends that way because the untouchable always eventually overreach. They always pick the wrong target. They always mistake someone's restraint for an inability to act. What I had to learn, and it took years, and it took Jenna lying in that hospital bed, and it took standing in the dark next to her tomato plants thinking about Preston. Is that intelligence without restraint is just a weapon pointed in every direction at once. I had the capability to handle this differently. I want to be honest about that. There were moments in those 11 days when the capability was right there, and the restraint was the only thing standing between me and a decision I couldn't walk back. The restraint wasn't weakness. It was the hardest thing I did in any of it. Cody asked me why I didn't hurt Preston. He was 12, and the question came out of genuine confusion, not cruelty, just a kid trying to understand how the world works when the rules don't seem to hold. I told him the truth, which is that I wanted to. And then I told him the other truth, which is that who I am when no one is watching, when I have the skill and the anger and the complete absence of oversight, is the only version of myself I actually have to live with. I could have made different choices in those 11 days and walked away from them clean in terms of legal consequences. But I'd have had to become someone my son couldn't look at the same way, and someone Jenna couldn't reach for in the dark when she wakes up on Miller Road again in her sleep. That's the math, not the math of what you can get away with. The math of who you are when the cost of becoming something else is zero, and you choose not to anyway. Preston will be out in a few years. I don't know what happens then. I don't think about it much. What he did lives with him now. That's not my burden to carry or my punishment to enforce. Victor Slade is facing federal charges that will outlast his legal team's best efforts. The people who were protected by the fact that no one ever pushed back hard enough, they are no longer protected, and Jenna is in her garden. And Cody is growing up knowing that his father came home and that coming home meant something more than just survival. That's the whole thing, really. That's the only part I'm sure I got right.